Right, thank you. We could start saying the names, perhaps. My name is Johan Söderberg, and me and Gustav Ek, we are organizing this circle within Nordic Summer University.
Yes, Gustav.
Maxi Gaz.
Elger.
Raphael Dernbach.
Right, so
you could say a few things.
yes. So the first thing, the place we're sitting at, you get some frame, is called the Nordic Summer University. And what's interesting about this is that it's the ambition of our getting together here and the organization as such is to bridge academia and the outside, and also various approaches within academia. So it has been, we have had roughly half natural scientists, practicing engineers, and half people coming from the social sciences and the humanities in this circle. And yeah, so that's very much the dynamic of what is going on here.
Introduce yourself.
Yes. So then I will say a few words about user freedom in software, because that is where my interest lies. I understand, or Eric has described, that most of you people on the other side are computer engineers. So for the background of the interest, if there's anyone that wants to ask questions about different stuff, then you can also ask questions about me, how it is to be a physicist and working with software, and whether or not my experience from the free software community work that I will describe have helped me also in my professional life. So that is one option. But what I want to talk about is my engagement in the free software community and one of the projects that we are doing in Gothenburg, which is focusing on user freedom, the user freedom aspect of the software, but we interpret that as in the case of a system. So what we do, the organization is called FreePost. What we do is provide a solution for electronic communication. We call it email. But we do it under free circumstances, freely organized. And what does that mean? So why do I say that FreePost is a free email, and compared with so there are some email solutions that you can use that are provided without a cost. I say those are perfectly unfree. FreePost, on the other hand, you have to take part in associations. Actually, you have to pay a membership fee, so that comes with a cost, and freedom is expensive. So what we do technically is that we create a system. So my role in this association, apart from administrative community work, I also am a system designer and architect for the solution. And what we do is we configure a bunch of different servers, and there's a lot of those kind of fundamental working with the servers kind of work, and then also we have all those technologies that are associated with emailing. That is like Postfix and dovecot, IMAP servers. I assume that you know exactly what I talk about here. So all the things that one can learn about those things is useful in case we want to build a free system. Also, of course, like LDAP, Ansible, those kind of tools and systems are things that we work with every day. So the question then, okay, so what is free communication? What does it mean that the system is free compared with that the software is free? So that all starts with the relationship between free software and open source software, for example. And what we say is that, and Richard Stallman stresses this, and I think that Eric have already said at some point, that the freedom is something that is connected with rights, so that is something connected with people, and those people are the users. And what we say is that the users are the free people, and the freedom is not lying in the software. The software is produced by the programmers, and it's not the programmers that should be free, but rather the product that the programmer provides. The same thing holds for a system if we create it. but a system is more complicated in that the ownership of a system is a little bit more intricate compared with the software, because if you have the software installed on your computer, you're perfectly in control of that software and therefore also the owner of the software. What we reacted against was this tendency on internet that everything becomes software as a service. This is, you log on to a homepage and you go somewhere to some other place and do computer work. Examples are Google Drive, etc., etc. And we want to understand, okay, so what would this, how could we do Google Drive, which is also one of the projects that we create, a free system for collaborative text editing, for example. That is what we consider being part of electronic communication. So this is important, and this is something that the association also should provide. So that is one of the things apart from just emailing that we do. So basically, this is like a full cloud solution, but it's totally under our control. Yes, I thought 5 minutes.
Sure.
So then we take 2 more minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yes. Okay. So yes. So there are a few requirements here so I need to be totally ownership of the system, which means that I need to have influence over the system. So that requires me in the association to have full knowledge, and me is also talking about everyone, and we are hundreds of people in this association, and everyone needs to have influence, and not only influence, but actually enough knowledge about the system in order to take part in important decisions. So one important thing, and this is the final thing I will say about how we organize decision making in the association is communication as well about the details of the system. So everyone that take part in the association need also to learn about what emailing is, and that is quite complicated sometimes to understand that. Most people don't know, though they use it. So therefore we, for example, organize workshops about how to send emails, what is an email system, what is single sign-on and administrative integration tools and those kind of things as well. So those are things that are important. And eventually, okay, so what we end up here is in an association that not only provides the system, but also relies on 2 other legs, which are the ordered education. So we end up being an educational institution as well. And also, of course, this comes with some values and eventually. So what we also are doing is the propaganda work. So have those 3 legs that we stand on. One is technical, one is educational, and one is on the information to the external crowd about what we're doing. And those are all requirements for a system to be free. And I say, Google, they do not comply.
Thank you. You could continue with Max if you agrees.
All right. So I am Maxigas. I have been working since 6 years at the Open University of Catalonia, and I have more than a decade of experience in media activism, hacking, and also working in the computer industry. So I was working professionally in Hungary, where I am from, and I also worked in London designing a system for 40,000 users to account for all the students in the London School of Economics. I was also studying during this time, so I spent 17 years in the university and did 4 masters and 3 BAs and dissertation and so on. So I'm also publishing under this name Maxigas, which I can tell you that publishing under one name is not a very good idea, because registering for conferences is becoming a nightmare. So Professionally, I do a bit of software development in Python. I work as a volunteer system administrator, so we have a collective that is made up from people from different continents, and we provide virtual machines, basically digital infrastructures to social movements. This has been going on also since 11 years now. I am based in Catalonia, in the middle of the forest, under the bridge, on the shore of one of the most contaminated rivers of Europe, in a place called Calafon, which is an eco-industrial post-capitalist colony. So we are there with more or less 20 people. Now there are 16 official inhabitants, and basically we are buying an old factory and a village that belongs to it. So we try to organize ourselves there and to develop technologies that are serving the people who live there, and not just serving the makers and capital and the state. So we have 28,000 square meters. And this is quite a technological challenge. So we have more than 70 devices on the network, excluding the end users. We are writing our own financial software, and we operate a beer factory, a bakery, a food cooperative, wood and metal workshops, a foundry, so we can make metal objects from casts, a marionette workshop, and of course a hack lab where there is software and hardware made. Personally, I am working with 3D printers, a book scanner. I was trying to build a turbidity meter to measure the contamination in the river. And at the moment, we are trying to build plastic recycling machines. So we are not only working with these technologies, but we are also trying to articulate a vision that can go beyond in a political way from the horizon that was defined by the free software and free culture movement. Because free software is very old, free culture is a bit younger, but it's still the same things, the same arguments that go around. And we believe that these arguments are already simply part of the of how production is organized in the capitalist system. So they are not necessarily progressive politically. Because of this, we found the idea of technological sovereignty, and last year we articulated it in a book. So all the different people who live in Calafo and who are working with us wrote different chapters about different topics. And this book has been published under a Creative Commons license and translated into 4 languages. This year we are trying to go even further, writing case studies about different aspects of technological sovereignty. If you want to translate the book, there is a Git repository, and everything is in plain text files with a markdown syntax. So if you write me an email, then I can grant you access to the repository.
Did we freeze?
And you can help in the translation. Briefly about technological sovereignty. I don't personally really like that we call it sovereignty because it reminds me too much of the state. But we didn't come up with this idea. The group that came up with the idea is called Via Campesina, who are an international movement of peasants, and they are struggling for what they call food sovereignty. And one day we saw that there are already people who organize themselves when they want to have access to good food into consumption cooperatives, and they make direct contact with the farmers and they buy the food from the farmers. And in this way they can ensure that the farmers have a better life, and at the same time the consumers get a good quality food. And then we thought, okay, let's try to apply this idea to self-organized technological providers. And I thought to, and then we tried to work in the colony with the different technologies according to this idea. And in fact, I don't know if it is good or bad, but by now the Barcelona City Council also adopted this idea. So they are also making publications and conferences about the idea of technological sovereignty. So I'd like to read you the definition that we are campaigning did for food sovereignty, and you can try to imagine how it would work for technology instead of food. So food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of the market and corporations. So this is the definition of food sovereignty, and then we can try to translate it into how it can look like in terms of technology. I will not do the whole exercise because I want to leave some space for your imagination. But for example, when we talk about an ecological aspect, you can also think about if we want to use a certain technology, what are the raw materials that are used in this? Are these materials local or not? What is the labor power that is used? Is this labor power by the local people or is it outsourced? What are the rights of these workers? And also, what is the energy use of this technology? How many kilowatts it consumes? So my main research topic as a scholar is cybernetics, and I'm talking about symmetric and asymmetric cybernetics. That is the good and the bad cybernetics. But at the moment, I will not go into this. I just wanted to flag that you can ask me about that as well if you want.
Good. So we'll continue with the next speaker, and it's a bit of a change of perspective because she's an economist.
Yes. My presentation, hi everybody. My presentation will be more theoretical than the two previous presentations, were more concrete about some cases. I'm going to talk about the software market, how we can consider the software as a good, and how we talk about industrial software and market. We consider the good because the application of the property rights. And the market of software has a specificity. It's the accumulation of the property rights. We have the patent system, which is more adopted in the US, Japan, and recently also in Europe, for some cases of innovation that can be applicable for industry. And we have, on the other hand, the system of license. And there we have the famous copyrights, of course, but also the free open source license. And I said the free open license because there is two systems of application of this license, which are the copyleft and non-copyleft. So the copyleft, it was more adopted by the Free Software Foundation, and the non-copyleft by the OSIM. And the consequence of this application of property rights makes that we talk about piracy. So piracy is the abuse of or misuse of any terms of license, and then we can have two products of piracy: the property software, which can be pirated, but also the free software can be pirated by not respecting the terms of the free open license. This kind of consequence has that we can talk about three products in the software market: the proprietary one, the open source, and the pirated programs. And this kind of schemes with three forms of products in the market is not only a preparation of the software. We can find it also in other markets, like the medicines, for instance, where you have the patent medicines produced by very famous and powerful laboratory, but you have also the generic medicines, and in parallel you have the all operated copy of molecules that are produced mainly by some developing countries like China and some other Asian countries. So that is my presentation, a little bit maybe short, but I wanted to put you in the framework of theoretical analysis of any market, how we consider it, the products as generating profits, and how can we make it appropriation for its developers.
Short is good, so thank you for that, because we also at some moment want to have a dialogue amongst yourself and with the students in the class, so that's just a hint, but of course feel free to hold your talk the way you want to.
No, I'll keep it short too. My name is Eric Deibel. I'm a filmmaker and currently a researcher on science fiction, and I'm a little bit like the oddball, I guess, on the board, because I'm coming from, not from a tech and not from a market perspective, so I'm more like coming from a disruption perspective, I guess. And I think what I can contribute to the table here is a certain kind of doubt, because in my research on science fiction that I've been doing, it's always amazing to see how films in the 70s have predicted certain technologies that are present right now. But what I'm much more interested in my research there is the particular blind spots that science fiction has not been able to predict. And this comes from a theoretical interest, so I'm writing a book about those blind spots at the moment, but also from a very personal interest, because I'm very interested in failed science fiction films. So in science fiction films that were made because of production reasons, because of political reasons. And a film that I'm working on right now is actually using some unrealized scripts from East Germany. So I'm from Berlin, and we found in the archive some scripts from the 70s that, due to several reasons, were not realized. And it's a very interesting group. So the GDR, the communist East Germany, they were very afraid of American science fiction, so they didn't have their own science fiction for themselves, so they found it like a task force. Okay, now we have to develop socialist science fiction. And from the task group, a very interesting range of ideas came out. So for instance, they were talking about how can we abolish money, how can we deal with mental health, because as a socialist country, East Germany obviously was believing that they were already living in a certain kind of utopia. So mental health was some kind of like a disturbing factor. What can we do about it? And due to political reasons, but also due to financial reasons, only one of those films was realized. And it was a complete flop. Nobody wanted to see it because it was really, really crappy. And as I'm very much interested in the failures of science fiction and in those things that you cannot predict, I think that attracted me to the material. And when I'm reading the title of the panel, Emerging Technologies Disrupting the Market, I think the first association that comes to me are very shiny images, like smart cities and self-driving cars. And I think it's really difficult that we have that kind of association, because I think the future will look very, very different from these kinds of buzzwords and buzz images. And I think if we also, and those images are also images of a particular interest group, most certainly directed to certain investors who want to invest in oftentimes very proprietary products and networks. And I think it's really important to also look for the failures and for like the little frictions, and maybe propose images that are different from those shiny smart cities and disruptive technologies. And I hope we can discuss it. I think I'm really looking forward to hear more about your research. That's for me.
So the last speaker is your the author of the text on 3D printing that is on your exam from Monday or for next week. So that alone is an opportunity why you might want to ask questions after we are done with the last. If he says it's right, I can't contradict him.
Very good. So I have your attention. Yeah, besides my name, I'm based in Gothenburg, which is the second largest, or maybe I should say smallest town of Sweden on the west coast. And at the department, which is called the Philosophy, Linguistics and Theory of Science department. And my part in that very long name is the Theory of Science. Basically philosophy of science. As my English is sometimes not adequate, people sometimes hear me saying fear of science, which is not entirely correct. But more specifically, what I have been interested in for a long number of years has been the imaginaries, which are sort of growing to the side of technology, especially, and to some extent science, and what kind of imaginaries are fostered among engineers. So the kind of relation which grows there in these communities, in your community actually, in your school, when it's then sort of separated out from that environment and then pops up in Kalafu or in the free cost organization which you have in Gothenburg and so on. And then there are continuities, but there are also breaks in how technology is imagined and put in relation specifically to technologies in relation to markets or money and in relation to politics. So what seems to be a very recurrent tension is, on one hand, thinking of technology as something which can replace politics or replace the need for representation or for doing deliberation and talking for endless amounts of times and so on. You're doing absolutely the reverse. So that's a kind of a turning technology into putting it under these kind of talking bodies, right? But that kind of tension is on the one side, and the other side, which is also running through very often in these engineering imaginaries, is in relation to money. So money can typically be seen in two ways. Either it is something fairly irrational, which comes in through management, or it comes in through shareholders who know nothing about technology or bosses and so forth. And then in that kind of way, technology stands for the more rational. Like, we could actually solve these problems for the better of everyone if we hadn't had to do with these out market department demands and these kind of things. So there has always been that kind of thing. But then there has been the opposite side, where money is actually a benchmark for measuring efficiency. And then it becomes rather ingrained or integrated into the very engineering process itself. And then it no longer exists as a talking point, as something which is so these are like two tensions, and that I have found over and over again within that engineering imaginaries. And so
so the 3D printer is actually a self-replicating machine.
Yes, quite well. So you're familiar about the self-replicating argument and how they were, and I will connect to that one comment you gave. So so the idea there, as you remember, is that by making a machine which is so advanced that it can make itself, this will have as an effect that there will be no politics and no markets. So firstly, you will have no, you cannot charge for those parts because they can be reproduced and copied, and you can give it to your neighbor. So that's very straight software, free software. If you just do not claim ownership over it, you can copy it infinitely, so there can be no ownership. So that was kind of the idea applied to the 3D printer. And of course, if it's that advanced that it can make itself, it can also make basically any other tool or product or consumer good. and thus abolish the market in those goods as well. So this was kind of the shell, the imaginary shell, which was there and which was necessary. So this connects to this utopia future kind of vision. But it was also part of management of that project. You needed that kind to pull in interest, pull in.
That's okay. Yeah.
Are you still there? Yeah. Okay. So you needed that as a form of catching attention, which becomes crucial in then to pull in resources. But then, of course, that didn't work out, and that was also a way of circumventing the need for politics, because then, as this Adrian Boyer, who started the whole thing, put it, that through self-reproducing 3D printers, everyone can own their own means of production. There is no need to buy or sell, but nor is there a need to storm the Winter Palace and claim those by violence, which basically was the same as politics in there. So these were kind of the ways that they were imagining that they, through technology, could abolish these things. And then that didn't work out so well, as you remember from the text. And what has interested me is to see the repetition of that going all the way back from where this technology comes from, and from let's say, early 19th century French engineers who are sort of at the aftermath of the French Revolution, and who are sort of embodying those ideas within their technologies. This is Saint-Simonians. And there already you had these ideas of building networks and facilitating communication and making peace in this kind of way. Though those networks were channels, like digging those communication networks and so on. So there has been this connectivity, and I think that to put it in that kind of historical length is also so crucial to see how oneself has been reproduced into having those ideas and so forth. So that's very much where I guess my task. And then I will come back to this one line comment, Maxigas, because at one point I was talking to I was doing those interviews with various developers of the 3D printer, and then there were the first company, the first startup which was developed out of it, and who were trying to establish a market, even though the point initially was to abolish that. They were sort of turned to me and they said that yes, in fact, the difference is that those other guys who were the hobbyists, who were developed the machine in this other direction, making it self-reproducing, abolishing politics and markets and so forth. What distinguished them from us is that we have kids. So we have to get a return on our investment. We spend this much time in developing it, designing it so that it can sell in the market, and we cannot do that unless we get a return on that. So we can. And those people are semi-retired or whatever. So one could spin this around, spinning it from the machine to the subjectivity, to the imaginaries of the engineers, and say that if you want to build a self-reproducing printer, you cannot have self-reproducing engineers.
Okay. We want to open up the floor to you guys. We of course went over time. That's what happens often in panel discussions with lots of people. You can't see me, but I'm right here. So I hope you guys have questions, and it's perfectly fine to diverge from what they told you and just ask them what you find interesting or what you would want to know something more about. They have a wealth of expertise beyond what you just heard, so I would encourage you just to make use of that. Grab your chance.
I think it's, first of all, directed to all of us. I think there are relationships between science fiction and technology. There are lots of examples, I guess, where also science fiction authors were invited, for instance, to consult technological companies. I think all the big, even now, all the big Silicon Valley companies have in-house science fiction authors, which is a really weird program. So, for instance, Microsoft has this program where you're invited as a science fiction writer and spend 1 year in their development labs, where you visit the different labs and can basically move freely like a cat and just listen in. And from that, you write different kind of scenarios that then are given to the engineers. So the art form of science fiction and I think the development of technology have certain feedback loops, but I think also certain feed-forward loops. Do the technologies already exist? I mean, so it's really common among science fiction writers, and I think the scene to say, yeah, science fiction is not so much about the future, but actually it's much more about the present, right? So whenever you write something, even projecting something into the future, what you actually do is writing about the present. But I'm a little suspicious about that too, because what good science fiction does is at first criticizing the present, but it also, I think, opens up certain ways of thinking. And I'm not saying it predicts certain technologies. It can do that, but that's not the important part. But it actually enables you to imagine things that you haven't been thinking about before. And I think this opening up is much more important than being right in a prediction. I don't know, but like, I think I'd love to hear more from the two of you on that question, because I think what you do is very applied science fiction, I would say.
I can respond. I totally agree. It's applied science fiction, and what I do. So I was talking about technologies before. I mentioned a few technologies, all of them being very old, very established. But I talk about what I do as a juvenile thing. I'm unique in what I do. And I think Max would say the same. Like it's rather about documentation of technology and putting technology in the hands of the users than it is about the development of new technology. And I think many times that science fiction writers they ask the same questions. It's not about technologies as such, but rather what they explore are the power relationships between people and technology as a means for communication of power, and they explore those things as well, which is equally important, or even maybe I would say maybe even more important than the technological development as such, which usually are quite trivial. Actually, coming from a physics background, when I look at technology, it's always quite trivial.
Okay. When we talk about piracy, we should keep in mind that there is producer of pirated programs and users. So piracy has two aspects, users and producers. So now, if we take a look at the aspect of producers, who can produce pirated copies or pirated programs? Then we have two productions system, let's say, hackers, because they can estimate that they are right to use some part of the source code or whatever interface to produce another program more performant and more innovative. And it could be also productions by unconscious misuse, in a way, of license terms. Then you have pirated products on the market. Then you have the users who download, shared illegal copies, and then you have diffusion of more pirated goods and products on the market. In economy, we talk about it in terms of substitution effects and sample effects. We said that pirated copies can substitute the property products and causes lost for the industries. But we said at the same time that there is optimal conditions that allow the pirated copies to the property one to be more locked in the market, to be more diffused, to create more network effects. This is what we call it also the sample effect. Less than pirated for a while, some part sometimes, in order to make it bigger market share, bigger network effect of the original products. So piracy can then consider it in two ways, in a positive way and in a negative way. So
I mean, why it's so popular? This is we had this sort of a little pre-session, a breakfast, and sometimes this is really a question I'm posing myself because it became so clear how much it sort of was hooked up to the hype cycle, and that became a very clear to me because I was myself sort of being strapped to that cycle by talking about 3D printers. And so I could almost sense going from, so I did that study very early. I did those interviews in 2009, 2010, and then it was like below the radar, and then sort of the hype peaked 2011, 2012, and then it went down again. And so over those conferences and various seminars I attended, I could almost sense in the pitch of the voices of people posing questions and discussing it, where it was on that cycle. And what becomes particularly extraordinary is that this is not the first such cycle, but many of us and those people everyone who has had a few years in the scene have seen a few of those peaks. And still, every time it sort of manages to pull in these longings and desires and wishes for the future and so on. So I think this, what we were saying for the breakfast was that one would almost need to consult some kind of literature on sectarism and why do people want to be give their money to the Scientologists and there's also it is only because we really want to believe in something, even though we have believed in before. There were long time ago there was the paperless society. We would have those 2 days. Thanks to electricity and electronics, we would no longer have papers. These would be abolished by now, and so then there's been after and after, and we have lived through them, and we still really want to be fooled, I guess. Which would, so that would be one way of actually trying to attack that question. Another such very, I felt very telling little anecdote, which I also told about here before. I ran into a librarian in Sweden, and she was telling me that the politicians were no longer interested in having kids reading books, and books was paper, so that was all and so on. So, but they love this idea of makers and maker spaces and so on. So basically, to get some public funding allocated to the library, they had put a 3D printer in one corner, and it was sort of standing there attracting public funding to the library, so they could carry on lending out books. And so I think this, finally, we're all sort of forced to take various strategies to this hype, only to carry on with something else. Finally, I think that's part of it also.
So the 3D printing becoming a global phenomenon. How would you explain that from your perspective? I would retranslate your question. I hope that's all right.
Okay. Yeah, a global phenomenon, not global good. We are sure we are talking about the specific terms of global phenomenon. How can we, you have some factors that can help a product or a good, make distinction between product and goods by introducing the property rights, that can help it to become global events or global technology or global phenomenon. In my sense, it will be first the price. Price will help a lot to the diffusion of technology. Then also nowadays, how easy is it to use the technology? I mean, is the interface, users interface, not the material one, the apparent for users, simple individuals, will be similar to what people or individuals use or learn about it. So if the interface, users' interface are similar to what we know already, it can help that a product or goods becomes more diffused. Then also the war of property rights if we arrive to some consensus of which kind of license or which kind of regime, property regimes right we are going to apply, it will help a lot the technology to be diffused. Knowing that in technology, in material one, it's quite hard to control it. There is a very huge war and debate about how can you introduce property rights to make material goods under control. So these three, for the moment, these three factors can help the technology to be more diffused. These other factors more linked to institutional context that will be more specific to each countries and to each development level categories of countries. But maybe I will say that this, the learning effect and switching cost to new technology, the price, and the application of property rights to these technologies will help to have it more global and more diffused.
But as far as I understand, the original idea of the 3D printer as a self-replicating machine, the idea there was to apply property rights to bring the price to zero and to make it very difficult for users to produce it, but to motivate them with an opportunity to become another person and to catapult humanity beyond the capitalist age.
Yes, the articulation of these three factors depends on the strategy of the developer, who is developing it. Is it hackers communities? Is it big or small business? So the articulation of the three factors will depend on the initial strategies. What you want to do with this technology. I'm maybe missing your experience about the concrete examples about 3D, but from theoretical point of view, it will be the way how we are going to consider it, the phenomenon to analyze.
Yeah. But this also connects to the previous question, or at least the response to that question. Okay, so how is this received by persons that are thought as users? And in this case, like those are individuals, and 3D printing becomes more of a lifestyle thing than actual. It does not do anything concretely. But in the idea of the self-replicating machine comes a critique of the actual means, like the circumstances for production in society. So you suggest like a new way of producing stuff, and with again, and this connects of course with the influence relationships between people. But then of course you to arrive at the consequences of that critique, which is that okay, so this is the next production mode. Then of course the printing aspect needs to be communitalized, where you have to take it to a broader step, because it will not be in each and every person's home. The purpose is that it should produce itself, not that it should produce itself in your house, which is the difference.
It comes to mind, there is a pattern when I study hacker culture, that a lot of times I realize that when they develop a particular technology, sometimes they don't develop it in order to solve a practical problem. And this is, I think, one of the ethos of engineering, that an engineer is solving a practical problem. So a hacker might develop a patch to a software or even machines just to make a rhetorical point or to unleash a desire. And then these machines are not important in the sense of efficiency or problem solving. These machines are interventions into debates. And I think that the different hacker scenes are important or interesting from a science and technology point of view, exactly because they can make rhetorical points and critical observations, not just through talking and writing as the useless academics, but in practice as an intervention into not just these courses, for example, but also potentially markets.
Just a little bit of information. Probably Hajar is going to join us in Ankara in the winter. We're not entirely sure yet, but she will be physically with us for a couple of weeks or months, and we will try and introduce her into the next version of STS the next semester. I added to that, we analyzed in class patents by Amazon trying to own the distribution of designs on 3D printers to sort of show. So that is what he is referring to. And what kind of economic convergence do you see taking this development to the next level? That's a bit interesting.
Yeah, I think Amazon is really a place to keep one's eyes on, and even more so this earlier invention of Amazon, which they, as you might know, called the Amazon Mechanical Turk. Yes, well, and that was very much ingrained within their. Of course, I mean there is a whole colonial aspect to that system. But so this is about 10 years ago. I'm not really sure, 15 maybe. It's quite a long time back. Yeah, when they introduced a way of parsing up tasks which could not be automated and distribute them across over the internet for having people to solve it. Now it has become more commonplace, so that we are like to crowdsource the whole things and so on. But they were actually very much ahead of time in introducing this, and so that meant that they could make and there are several things which are interesting to ask here in relation to automation. So this is kind of very menial tasks, those which on the one hand can be put out and resolved, like but which could not at that time or continuously, that which remains, which has not yet been possible to automate and solve with an algorithm. And so that at that time at least software had problems to identify photographs. So that was such a task which companies could, through Amazon, demand to have, for instance, photos of street corners analyzed to see if is there a Starbucks or is there a competitor to a Starbucks, and things like that. Loads of such tasks. And then they were paid pennies for that. And in such a way they could put out also that labor globally and put it out to especially to India and such places. And the reason why it was called the Mechanical Turk, this was playing to an old like automatas that were built in the late 18th century, typically for the royal courthouses and such. And yeah, if you can find a picture of that. And so the one which made a huge scene, and which was, I think, was this supposed automated chess player. And later it was revealed that they had put a midget in a box, and he pulled strings and whatever. And it seemed like you had someone moving those chess, pieces of chess. And this machine, I think, played against Voltaire and some royals and all kinds of things. And they dubbed it Turk because at that time, of course, the great threat was the Ottoman Empire. So that was sort of adding this sort of threat of the automation and of that history. And so Amazon picked that up, and they used that service, basically, that platform to crowdsource, to parse up labor tasks. What I'm giving all this story for is because I think this is exactly where 3D printing lies ahead in the future. And this is what your question is pointing to, that you've already seen early attempts like that to putting out production in the same way, but into the material production, so that finally we who have that 3D printer either in our homes. Yeah, that's do you see it? I think you have to bring it closer to. Cool.
The picture of the what is it called?
Digital, no.
The mechanical Turk from the 18th century.
Eric, look in the miniature and see how it.
There. Is it here? Okay, good.
Okay, so well, you can easily find that googling it. But that's to make another pitch also for the importance of having that historical perspective and how it returns, like the internal return, and to see what the importance will be of the 3D printer in the future, despite all those histories which is needed in order to bootstrap it initially. You can see then connecting back to the mechanical Turk and then to the other machineries which it comes out from, what is more likely to become of it.
So how will Amazon continue?
Yeah, that I should answer, but I did, but I can't. No, I can't.
Maybe I can add just one point about it. Amazon trying to create the market by creating use and needs. So this is the risk with such strategy. It can works and it cannot works if it's not adopted easily by the users. So that's why we don't have any prediction about how it's going to work for such technology online.
The future is still open.
Oh, but they are not taking like a risk here. No, zero risk. This is
that's true. There is no loss, but it's opportunity lost. So effectively, there is no loss, but you can lose the potential profits. So this is the kind of risk. So if it works, you generated the profits. If it doesn't work, it's okay. But this is kind of cost, but called opportunity cost.
So from a systemic point of view, so Amazon is one business that does one thing, but looking at the system where we organize production again. As businesses, the general strategy of creating markets is not a risk, that is a consequence.
It depends.
It comes with the fundamentals. And again, like of course it will happen, either Amazon does it or someone else does it. And usually what we see that Amazon, what they're doing, because thanks to their efficiency of production or provision chains and delivery chains, and also the size of their overall, like the people that use it, the size of the platform, they can run after those aspects of delivery that no one else can afford to run for.
Yeah. That's true that the cost of production still is quite new, zero in such industry, and the cost of all the development is still high and less than compared to other industries for material goods. So,
but let's take the case of the ebook reader. Okay, so this is nothing developed by Amazon. Technology as such is not developed by Amazon, but it made very, very cheap by Amazon. And then also they put proprietary restrictions on the delivery chain of it, and therefore they could get it out to people. More people, and they could run after tails where no one else can run, and that's where all their profit come from. And this is why Amazon will continue to be a business forever, because it's an icon for the system of businesses. It's not one single business. It's actually it's actually a system of businesses, and they will sustain forever.
Yeah.
And I would maybe like to open up that argument even more a little bit, because I mean what Amazon has patented there is a very particular technological component. But I think the reason why 3D printing became such a hype or such a fetish even is the more general idea of self-replication. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an idea that has a lot of future. If it will take the form of 3D printing, I would disagree. I think there's a chance that the self-replication will become such a thing as with the 3D printers that we know, but I think there's a higher chance that it will take on a very different kind of form. Yeah. That there will be a different.
There is already self-replication, for example, in the case of fire. That once you light a fire on a street corner, you can replicate it to other fires. And the fire is also very nice because you can give other people, you can share your fire, and you can also keep it at the same time.
Exactly, exactly.
That was a joke. Very funny to us here. I hope you're still into the joke. If not,
So I think it's a joke that comes with a bit of critique of the concept of self-application, and it's a relevant critique, and that is okay. So to take technologies such as the idea of so in agriculture we have certain ideas of making agriculture more efficient, and that is of course a self-replicating idea. So if you can, for example, fecalities from the chickens into the ground again, that will be more efficient system. So there will be more grass that the chickens can eat, and that's okay. So it's a self-replication idea.
That's true. So to come back to the history of cybernetics a bit, in the 1950s there was a big debate between would-be computer scientists, because at that time there was no computers, only a desire for computers. And the debate in the 1950s was what is better, an analog computer, a digital computer, or a biological computer. And one of my projects in Calafo was exactly to try to build a biological computer in order to see what is the difference between such a technology and the ones that we use now. But one of the things that is now very common or very fashionable, very hyped in hacker circles is exactly biohacking. And I see the connection there, that in fact the cyberneticians like Maturana and Valera are defining life. So the definition of life for them is something that can reproduce its own form. Right. And in the beginning, they were defining this in order, the problem that they came up with is to define what is the domain of biology. So how biological entities are different from other things. And by the time that their book became too successful, which kind of ruined their projects, because after a decade or so, the interpretation that people took away from this definition is that they could write programs that are self-reproducing, and therefore these would be living programs. And I think that this is more or less bullshit. This doesn't work. But your observation is very good, that it would be nice to have self-replicating things, and in fact we have self-replicating things. They are called biological life forms. And I think that there is a very clear path there, where, as Stafford Beer, one of the UK cyberneticians, said, why we want to develop machines that do a certain thing, if we can just find them in nature and try to make them useful in our lives. So I think that the biological technologies will have a great future. This is my prediction of science fiction.
So I want to at least give another chance to ask their questions and put them a little bit in the center of the discussion. It's very difficult to keep the panel under control, as you can see. They tend to go in all sorts of directions. Are there any more issues that you would like to ask them?
I mean, I think that there has been many such, and for quite some time, alliances or whatever, where various university departments have set up their own sort of semi-organized, like sort of semi-outside of themselves, innovation labs or communal workshops and things, trying to draw in students into that and so on. I mean, on one level, I think that question could be answered as a quite straightforward yes. You know, well, here you have a big chunk of public money or whatever to go straight into an activity that previously were organized on a much smaller scale. So clearly that will scale up what goes on. I think that is, and then it creates a market, and then people will turn to it and so on. So I think that is already has happened for some time. But then it depends on what progress is in this affair, and I mean, returning to who initiated it and for what purpose and so forth. And there you can see how from the side of those various communities who are in this way linked into the colleges, linked into the universities, there are also, it certainly does not leave that activity unchanged. You know, you don't get the same thing within that institutional frame. That's for clear.
I like to just from the idea of how to use 3D printers in colleges, not for material production, but for actual research. That why the history of cybernetics in 50s, 60s, somewhat in the 70s is interesting for me is exactly because these people were mathematicians, philosophers, social scientists, but they were thinking through these machines. So they were creating these machines, observing these machines, and by building these machines, they could at the same time develop new theories in anthropology, in physics, in biology, or even in mathematics. So I think that the application of 3D printers could be something like this, how we explored this idea of, for example, of destroying the market through self-replication. It was a kind of epistemological tool. So the leader of the biological computer laboratory, Heinz von Forster, was always saying that what they are doing is experimental epistemology. So they are building some machines, but not to actually to solve material problems, but to open their imagination to other ways of thinking about the problems that they are dealing with. In history, we haven't seen this. Usually in history, what is the problem is that there is not enough fire. So as a rule of thumb, I think it's always good for going for more fire.
We are very far north. They look at heat differently here.
We said that good innovation, distract and create it. So we need sometimes distraction to create its big teams. The role of hackers?
Yeah, the role of hackers, but he puts the. So I have to rephrase a little bit because it was difficult to hear. On the, it's the paradox that we are familiar with. On the one hand, hackers help diffuse certain technologies and they become more widespread, and hence they help also the innovation, the markets, etc. And on the other hand, they undercut other people. They undercut other people's ability to develop that technology. So, and that's very much speaks to the theme of our panel. So that's the question: what's the role of hackers in this sort of wider process? Who wants to take the question?
So I can start as claiming to be a hacker in some sense, though humbler. So I would like to reflect to what Max and Guest were saying before, that hacking and engineering are two different things, and the role of a hacker, if you consider yourself to be a hacker, is that you also have an ambition of changing something. So this is development of okay. So it's focused on development, but what you develop is a suggestion for another way of doing stuff, and it's not a new innovation that comes from hacking, as in its broad term, but rather a suggestion to do the same thing but in a different way. And from a profitable point of view, so how business usually make the use of hacking is in the next step. So like a hacker suggests a new way of doing something. So instead of sending complicated messages through email, which might not be complicated, they suggest, okay, let's do it short messages instead. And then this idea can be made profitable. This is probably not a good example. I have not prepared this, but it's rather the way we do things than what we actually do.
Anybody else wants to add to the question? Respond to the question.
Maybe someone should underline the ethic of the hackers.
Right.
This is really important. I mean, hackers are not crackers. Even if some situations, sometimes hackers are obliged technically to crack some interface in order to progress the innovation. So the ethic of hackers are really important to underline, and sometimes it's misused with media. Sometimes we said, okay, hackers are really different from crackers, and they have ethic. They look for freedom, users for freedom, technology progress. And sometimes when we have some cyber attack, like recently Liechtenstein or for the American election as well, Russian cyber attack, then we misuse the term of hackers, and then we start to have the stature of the hackers like pirates, illegal behavior without any purpose, only the personal one to get profit, personal interest and profit. So I think this point, maybe as you guys, you are hackers, you should really underline and defend. I mean, the motivation are completely different from what we saw sometimes in media concerning cyber attacks.
I would like to challenge actually what you say, because I think it is really important to include criminal activities under the heading of hacking.
Yeah.
And also to include the criminals that are doing damage to capital and sometimes the state, sometimes to private innocent persons in the hacker community at large. And that is because the hacker community that is not bound together by any concept of legality or illegality, or even not by any ethics, in fact. I think that what is called usually the hacker ethics cannot be really formulated as an ethics. It's, for example, always geared to the hands-on imperative. This is one of the lines from 1984, The Heroes of the Computer Revolution, Stephen Levi-Stone, where he defines the hacker ethics. In terms of philosophy, this has nothing to do with ethics. It just means that you have to engage with the material agency of technology. And I think that where hackers meet and form a community is with this meeting with material agency and meeting with unexpected things that technology can do. And there is a point where the hacker comes to the real ethical moment that has very little to do with the hacker ethics itself, where, for example, you find a bug, you find an error in a program, and then you have to decide whether you sell it to the vendor to make capitalism more efficient and capital flows more replicated, or you want to sell it on the black market where maybe this technology will be used against activists, or maybe you can use it also in an attack against the same forces. So you can, at this moment, when you discover a bug, there is different possibilities of becoming an activist, becoming a criminal, or becoming a businessman. You can even just use it to develop your own programs and not tell it to everybody, and then you stay to be a developer, for example. But that doesn't change whether you are a hacker or not. You are a hacker because you are discovering technology and you met the unknown and you've seen something that nobody's seen before in technology. At the same time, well, I will not go into the Luddite aspects of hackerdom because that's another topic, but if you want to Google it, you will find my research. I just want to make this point again that I think that criminality is an essential part of hacker scenes. Criminal hackers are an essential part of hacking as such. And I think it takes, I think in fact the social function of criminals is exactly to defend hacking from recuperation, from becoming part of new official state-sanctioned markets. And then we have an even more sophisticated analysis where we see how this illegality is also creating markets of its own. But I think that in order to keep the edge of hacking, the agency of hacking, we have to cling to its criminal components. Even, for example, about copyright, it is not free software. Free software, even open access in academia, has nothing to do with opening, making information free. It has absolutely zero effect. What the effect that it has is the mass illegality of people sharing these things that in fact cannot be stopped either by the state and the capital. The effect is the desire that makes people go beyond the institutions.
Yeah, you are putting the fire.
He is very provocative speaker.
Maybe what some point can make your speech more authentic, but more is the distinction between the case situation when you hack and were considered in illegal sphere, because there is some license, there is some property rights that they said, here you should stop. And the hacker said, no, sorry, this is institutional right that you guys established to make it more profit, that I estimated like technically not available. I mean, I need to cross this border in order to make, and you know it, to progress the technology or to develop more product. And there is the second situation, I just finished with this, we link it with the motivation of the hackers. What is his motivation? And then if the motivation is to feed for his own interest, then we are in illegal morality, access to morality and cyber attacks, and then we cannot consider it like benefit for the hackers communities, neither for progressing innovation, nor for how to say, there is no shaft for hackers, but there is kind of moral codes shared, moral codes shared between hackers. This is, I think, the distinguish. If we make it to analyze any situation of cyber attacks of hacking, can make things different, and can then make your speech very. I mean, too. I mean, yes, I got what you mean, but maybe if someone doesn't have in mind what is the motivation behind the crack, then it's not moral and it's not acceptable. So, but if you get it at this motivation technical one, and this is just because someone established de facto on level some property rights for its own interest, then we can say no, we don't accept it. And
you have caused a debate. This will take a while to resolve.
But there are some. I guess in terms of morals, so hackers are usually very moral on what they do, and there is a share, like there is a body of morality, and you find similarities, but it's very individual as well. So everyone is have very different motives, and of course, the things that you usually do not find is selfishness. So the benefit for yourself is usually not thought about when you do hacking stuff. Because what you do is you do it for the community, or you do it. Okay, so many things you do for your own pride, because you want to have your name stated in different places, and those kind of things you find. But in terms of the technological development, it's like if you develop a tool for piracy, it's not because you want to use it. It's because you want others to use it, because you want people to refer to you. The same thing is if you develop a program for music development or film creation. It's like the developers of film creation tools are not film creators. They don't want to benefit from the tool that they do. They want to benefit from getting the pride that you are using.
Film, yeah.
And in terms of lines crossed here,
yeah.
So there are lines that are put by others, like juridical systems.
Yeah.
We don't see them. It's not that we cross a line. That's not how
Yeah.
It doesn't feel.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. That I think that hacking itself, the act of hacking, has nothing to do with legality and nothing to do with moral. And because of this, the hacker is defined not by an opposition to moral or an opposition to law. It is, the hacker is defined by an indifference, by that for hackers, these kind of limitations are not interesting.
And so for example, me and Eric, we had this discussion before, like you were asked, can I use your computers instead of stable internet?
Right.
Because, of course not. I will not run a proprietary application on my computer.
He has the best computer, but he refuses to use Skype.
So, but I will never, but that is a decision that I take, and I ask you to respect that.
Yeah, I did.
But also, in the same way, I respect your decision to use this application in order to achieve this meeting, which is a great meeting. And so it's like, I think this is also something that is common between hackers, not between each and every one hacker, but it's typically what you find is very much respect for other people's morals. And it's like, if that is your decision, fair enough. It's like, I wouldn't, but do you do?
Shall I? Yes, say something. So, I mean, this does connect to the questions of, I mean, here clearly there is a new frame of illegality being invented, which did not exist there before, and so there is also the memory of very clearly of these things was not claimed under private ownership and law and things like that before, to the extent that I could upload whatever, and then that has interesting responses, and typically within the engineering imaginary of which I say because it sort of overlaps trade engineers and trade engineers who are also conceiving themselves as hackers, and so forth. Then that is to respond to these things in putting it in technical terms. And so when these first attempts were being made to make proper, like when 3D printing was coming and lawyers were rushing to it to see, all right, we can create a new niche for ourselves to sell our expertise and create new properties and so on. Then there were, I think, the very first conflict was about something called the Penrose triangle, which is like one of these impossible geometrical figures which you cannot have in 3D. You're finding it there, maybe. So you have a drawing of a triangle, but the lines meet in such a way that it's an illusion. It's an optical illusion, and you can have it on 2D because that's, if you look at a paper and a drawing, it's already an illusion that you are looking at something. And then there was this design. Yeah, this is it.
Is it open? It's talking about this triangle. Can you see it?
You get an idea. And so there were someone who were designing it for printing in such a way that it was sort of not, it wasn't meeting in the ends. But if you put it at a distance and you looked at it from the right angle, it looked like you had a 3D object doing exactly that. And this became the first intellectual property conflict around this very object. The one who had designed it finds that it's being spread on repositories, people are printing it, and he claims the right for it. And so what's that interesting is that it sort of immediately hooked up on the same kind of responses from the sort of emerging 3D printer hacker communities as you have had before in relation to the impossibility of protecting firelight and bits and software information. And then again, it was going back to the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics. It cannot be owned as property because it can be shared infinitely, and you know all of those stories. And again, you had the same kind of way of looking up on this new legal conflict around something which was just defying the laws of physics. So it wasn't even something to argue about. We didn't even need to take this to a court, to take this to legal decisions and so forth. And I think that's exactly the same. But what we have already seen from the case of the file sharing and the piracy and all of that is that the law does not need to to close to seal off the whole vehicle and seal off all the brakes. On the contrary, it's because it is so ineffective and it's so cumbersome, this intellectual property system, it can only function thanks to that it's being broken, that people are breaking it. So the pirates becomes weirdly themselves what is needed for there to be this flow, so that you can create new markets for demand and so on. And I think that is exactly what we're going to see again. You know, it doesn't matter that the actual Penrose triangle is not there in the air. The illusion works perfectly fine because we are anyway living in an illusion. So
that's a nice thing to end with. So that was, I suppose, the last question, unless there is some burning issue that you can can ask if you want. I will circulate some further links to these people, to their work that is available online, and you can check out where they are situated and what they do. But first, thank you very much. We enjoyed it a lot. I hope that you also enjoyed it. Okay, thank you. And I wish you a lot of good luck on your exam, which is coming next week, I suppose. Okay, thank you for your extra time and for sticking around a little.